On the 14th of February 1806, Marshal André Massena, leader of French military operations in southern Italy, rode triumphantly into the city of Naples. The Kingdom of Naples and Sicily had gone to war with France the previous September and was buoyed in the months that followed by the arrival of a joint Anglo-Russian expeditionary force to southern Italy to aid the Neapolitans against any potential French attack. But all had turned sour that winter. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, had won a crushing victory over the Austrians and Russians at the Battle of Austerlitz, effectively bringing the War of the Third Coalition to an end, while Massena had secured control over northern and central Italy. As the Austrians quickly negotiated yet another humiliating treaty with France, Naples suddenly found itself isolated, and the British and Russians began to evacuate their forces as the prospect of a major French assault on southern Italy loomed. King Ferdinand I of Naples and his family abandoned their capital and headed for Sicily in January, just as Massena was preparing to lead the army of Naples into the region it had been named after. Within a week of his campaign beginning, he entered the great city in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, while on the 9th of March 1806, a French army under Jean Reynier destroyed what remained of the Neapolitan army. Then came perhaps the most shocking moment in the invasion of Naples, as Joseph Bonaparte, the older brother of the emperor, was made King of Naples in late March 1806. Such was the manner in which Napoleon Bonaparte extended his grip over new parts of Europe in an almost casual fashion by the mid-1800s. While Austria and Naples had been comprehensively defeated within months of the war commencing in the summer of 1805, Russia was still at war with the French, and despite Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz in early December 1805, the British had no intention of establishing peace terms again with France. If there was something which distinguishes the War of the Third Coalition from the War of the Fourth Coalition, it was the decision by Prussia, which had remained neutral in 1805 when Austria and Russia joined Britain in the new conflict, to now ally with Britain, Russia, and Sweden against France. The decision to go to war with the French would prove to be a catastrophic strategic blunder for Prussia. At the time of the declaration, Napoleon and the French still had tens of thousands of men in Central Europe, as Bonaparte sought to follow up his victory over Austria by securing full control over the territories held by Britain in northern Germany, by right of the British Royal House of Hanover being the electors of Hanover in Germany as well. Consequently, the French were well placed to deploy their forces immediately against the Prussians. Indeed, even before Prussia declared war on France, Napoleon had begun mobilizing La Grande Armée to march on Berlin. The decisive engagements of the war with Prussia would occur on the 14th of October, less than a week after the conflict was entered into. It occurred in two separate clashes on the same day in the region to the southwest of the city of Leipzig. The two locations were next to the town of Jena and further to the north at Auerstadt. Napoleon commanded the bulk of the French forces at Jena, some 40,000 men in all, while Davout oversaw the French army at Auerstadt to the north. As with so many other pivotal military clashes of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the French were outnumbered at both Jena and Auerstadt. The battle nearly turned disastrous for the French early in the morning, when Marshal Ney led a large cavalry detachment against the Prussian lines without any order to do so from Napoleon. This foolhardy move resulted in the corps being nearly surrounded by the Prussians and Saxon troops before Bonaparte ordered Marshal Lannes to lead a detachment to rescue Ney and his men. At that juncture, if the Prussians had pressed their advantage and launched a frontal assault on the main French forces, they would have won the day. But indecision prevailed, and in the hours that followed, the Prussians fell prey to sustained French fire. This, combined with French attacks on the Prussian flanks, resulted in a bloodbath as the afternoon progressed, while to the north at Auerstadt, a disastrous deployment of Prussian troops in the morning had led to a complete rout, despite the numerical disadvantage Davout and the French had. By the time the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt ended that evening, the Prussians and Saxons had suffered tens of thousands of casualties in killed and wounded, while approximately 20,000 more men had been captured. But these were not pain-free victories for the French. Unlike at Marengo, Ulm or Austerlitz in times gone by, the French suffered over 12,000 casualties. Nevertheless, the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt was cataclysmic for the Prussians, and as with the victory at Ulm a year earlier against the Austrians, the defeat of the main Prussian army left Berlin open to an assault by Napoleon in the late autumn of 1806. On the 27th of October, Napoleon marched into Berlin, which had been partially occupied by Marshal Davout the previous day. As the French cavalry rode through the Brandenburg Gate, the French settled into conquering the second great capital of Central Europe in just under a year. With defeat at Jena-Auerstadt and the fall of Berlin in October 1806, Prussian involvement in the War of the Fourth Coalition was all but over. Yet, Napoleon still needed to vanquish the Swedes and the Russians, whose troop build-ups in Poland and other neighboring regions had continued throughout the autumn of 1806. The Eastern Campaign would eventually culminate in the Battle of Friedland on the 14th of June 1807, an engagement near the modern-day town of Pravdinsk in the Kaliningrad Oblast. As with the Battle of Ulm over a year and a half earlier, Napoleon found himself in the unusual position of outnumbering the enemy here. The French had campaigned well into the Baltic region, with a force of 80,000 men, though in the end, 15,000 of these would be held in reserve, as Bonaparte only utilized 65,000 at Friedland. By way of contrast, the Allied army, which was overwhelmingly made up of Russian forces, consisted of approximately 55,000 troops under the command of Levin August von Bennigsen, a German general in Russian employ. As both armies sought to take control of the town of Heinrichsdorf in the region, the Russians became trapped on the western side of the River Wena, with their pontoons to cross back over the river compromised. Faced with this situation, von Bennigsen had no option but to form up and meet Napoleon's army full on. Bonaparte responded by pulling up a force of 40,000 men in the center and unleashing a heavy artillery bombardment on the Russians. French victory at the Battle of Friedland effectively spelled the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition. In its immediate aftermath, Tsar Alexander of Russia sent envoys to the French and sought to negotiate peace terms with Napoleon. The resulting peace treaty, which was agreed between France and Russia near the town of Tilsit in what was then East Prussia, involved one of the most famous meetings of two emperors in world history. Napoleon would subsequently report back to his wife Josephine about Alexander after the meeting. "I am very well satisfied with him. He is a very handsome and good young emperor. He had more intelligence than one thinks." Such was the manner in which the famous meeting at Tilsit occurred. 2 days later, it was the turn of King Frederick William of Prussia to agree terms with Napoleon. Bonaparte was not so sanguine in how he dealt with the Prussian ruler. This second part of the Treaty of Tilsit inflicted a crushing set of surrender terms on the once proud German state. Bonaparte was about to enter into a period of increased nepotism in the aftermath of the War of the Fourth Coalition. The source of these changes was found in the Iberian Peninsula. In the 2 years that followed, what has variously become known as the Peninsular War of the Spanish Ulcer developed across the Iberian Peninsula. It is known as the Spanish Ulcer because it bled the French of resources and slowly inflicted immense damage on Napoleon's empire as a war which seemingly could not be won. By 1808, an old problem was freshly brewing for Napoleon. The events of the years between 1806 and 1808 had convinced many in Vienna that they needed to act against the French. The example of what had happened to Prussia with the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 worried many within the Austrian government. The War of the Fifth Coalition was preceded by diplomatic efforts by the Austrians to either convince some of the other great European powers to also make war on France, or at least remain broadly neutral. A new coalition was established, consisting of Britain, Austria, and rebels against French rule in Portugal, Spain, and southern Italy. They would face France and its many vassal states in Holland, Germany, the Duchy of Warsaw, and Italy, as well as Bavaria. Though by 1809 he was a different man to the one who had triumphed in such spectacular fashion over the Austrians in 1797, and again at Marengo and Austerlitz, Napoleon nevertheless responded to the outbreak of the War of the Fifth Coalition with his usual energy and drive. Though the Austrians only invaded Bavaria on the 10th of April, news reached Paris quickly, and Bonaparte left the capital almost immediately, arriving in Germany a week after the Austrians had commenced hostilities, to the surprise of many who still believed he was in France. Napoleon's response to the predicament he found La Grande Armée in when he reached southern Germany in mid-April was the Landshut maneuver, one of the most famous military maneuvers in history, the name of which is derived from it having played out near the town of Landshut, which the Austrians moved to attack around the time Napoleon arrived in southern Germany. Viewing this as an opportunity rather than a threat, Bonaparte sent messengers to Marshal Davout, who was several days' march distant, with a corps of French cavalry, with orders to rejoin the main army. He then positioned elements of La Grande Armée to break off the Austrian lines of communication back to Vienna, with the ultimate goal of trapping Charles and the Austrians in southern Germany and cutting off their route back to the Austrian capital. He achieved this spectacularly in the week that followed, with Davout and himself winning a series of battles, the most significant of which came at Echtmoul on the 22nd of April and Ratisbon on the 23rd. Napoleon suffered a wound to his ankle during the latter engagement. With these victories, Archduke Charles retreated away from the main French forces. Bonaparte had somehow managed to turn a difficult situation in southern Germany into another strategic campaign victory in just over a week. And with the success of the Landshut maneuver, the road to Vienna was free for Napoleon to advance yet again on the Austrian capital. This placed him in an extremely advantageous negotiating position. But as in 1805, he needed to win a decisive victory on the field of battle in order to bring the war to an end. The ensuing Battle of Aspern-Essling began on the afternoon of the 21st of May and lasted for over 24 hours of intense fighting centered on the village of Aspern. As a battle of attrition, the engagement was brutal, one of the bloodiest of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, and one of the most costly in lives that Napoleon, who had built his career on swift movements, which won engagements decisively by breaking the enemy lines without major loss of life, had fought. In the end, it was an Austrian victory of sorts, as Napoleon ordered a French retreat on the afternoon of the 22nd. What this indicates is the manner in which Napoleon's wars were leading to ever greater numbers of troops being deployed across Europe. When Bonaparte had first campaigned in Italy in the mid-1790s, a force of 30,000 or 40,000 men was large. By 1809, it was a token army that could not prove decisive on any front. As a result of this, it was nearly 300,000 men who took to the field at the Battle of Wagram, not far from Vienna, on the 5th of July, 1809. Both sides also had hundreds of pieces of artillery, and it was these combined factors which made the 2 days of fighting particularly bloody. By the time it ended on the 6th, both sides had suffered over 35,000 men killed and wounded. But with his superior army, Napoleon was able to claim victory, while the Austrian morale was broken in the aftermath of Wagram. Peace terms were soon being explored. The result, signed as the Treaty of Schönbrunn at Schönbrunn Palace near Vienna on the 14th of October 1809, was arguably the most humiliating set of terms yet for the Austrian government. With the signing of the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the War of the Fifth Coalition effectively came to an end. On his return to Paris, Napoleon was preoccupied with one issue. His marriage to his wife, Empress Josephine, had not resulted in children and an heir. It was in this context that Napoleon informed Josephine in late November 1809 that they would have to divorce so that he might remarry and father an heir. It was quickly concluded that Napoleon would marry Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the eldest child of Francis II of Austria. Next to Britain, Austria had been the most stalwart foe of France ever since the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars nearly 2 decades earlier. But it had experienced nothing but defeat after defeat in 4 different wars since 1792, most of them directly at Napoleon's hand. The marriage alliance now held out the possibility of a lasting peace between the 2 nations. For Napoleon, it would neutralize Austria and perhaps make it an ally in conflicts with France's only 2 major enemies that were left unvanquished, Great Britain and Russia. The ultimate collapse of the Franco-Russian alliance occurred at the very end of 1810, when Alexander announced on New Year's Eve that he was leaving the continental system and would no longer entirely restrict Russian trade with British merchants, though some blocks would still apply. On the 22nd of June 1812, Napoleon made a famous speech to his troops arraigned in Prussia, in which he declared that Russia had violated the terms of the Treaty of Tilsit and implored his troops in the following way: "Let us then march forward. Let us pass the Niemen. Let us carry the war into her territory. The Second War of Poland will be as glorious to the French arms as was the first. But the peace which we shall conclude will be its own guarantee, and will put an end to the fateful influence which Russia has for 50 years exercised over the affairs of Europe." 2 days later, on the 24th of June 1812, La Grande Armée crossed over the border into the lands of the Russian Empire. The die was now cast. Either Napoleon would defeat Alexander and become master of all continental Europe, or he would experience crushing defeat. Ahead lay the Russian winter,